Well, you're very welcome, everyone, and delighted to see such a massive crowd here for our final one of Series 19. I'm Jane Bulfin. I'm standing in for Stephanie this evening because she's not very well. Our speaker tonight, Denis Marnane, needs no introduction, I'm sure. He's been here longer than I have. We're delighted to have him today to talk about the landlord, his wife, the parish priest, and a tennis player. I'll leave him to explain what that's all about. Des.
Thank you very much, and good evening. I really should apologise for two things. One, the fact there's no PowerPoint. But as you're a somewhat older audience, you'll be well used to actually listening. You won't need the distraction of PowerPoint. And the second thing I need to apologise for is the soap opera nature of the title, which really doesn't explain anything. What I'm talking about tonight basically is what happened to Lena Rice's father between 1860 and his death in 1868. So that's basically the period I'm looking at. But before I get to 1860, I need to fill in a few background things. I'm a little bit wary about doing that. Some years ago, during the decade of centenary stuff, I gave a talk somewhere up the country. And it went fine, I think. And coming out of the talk, I was behind two people. And one said to the other, yes, that was very interesting, particularly stuff about Robinson and Breen that I didn't know. And the other chap said, yes, but it took him a long time to get there, which is a problem I'm aware of. So it won't take me a long time to get to 1860, but just to fill in some background. We start, of course, with Lena Rice, which isn't a name she appears to have used for herself. I've seen some official correspondence from her after her mother's death when she was helping to run the estate during the 1880s into the early 1890s. And she signed her own letters as H.B. Rice, which is Helena Bertha Rice. I presume she was Lena to her family and so on. The fact that we know anything really very much about Lena Rice and the whole tennis, this isn't a talk about sport, much less a talk about tennis, but it has to be referenced. And as you know, every year when Wimbledon comes up, there's usually a piece locally or nationally about Lena Rice. Not surprising. I mean, you know, the only woman to win the women's singles, and it's back in 1890. But it is a wonderful illustration of something called the tyranny of the single source. Basically, anything we know about Lena Rice, and particularly the tennis side of her, goes back to an article by the late Eileen Bell that was published in the very first edition of the Tipperary Historical Journal back in 1988. It's quite a short article. There's a misprint in it, in that Lena Rice's mother, her surname is given in that as G-O-R-D-E, Gord, which is a misprint for what it should be, which is Gard, G-A-R-D-E. And whether you're looking at the Dictionary of Irish Biography, which is pretty authoritative, or Wikipedia, which is not quite so authoritative, or all the articles, anything that ever appears, you'll find that misprint reproduced, coming from that original Eileen Bell source. With regard to Lena Rice, she comes into the talk here and there. She was hardly around very much in the 1860s, which is the period I'm talking about. When her father died in 1868, she was about 2, so she can't have had any memory, particularly of her father. They were a large family, 3 boys. 2 of them survived into adulthood and had very predictable, given their kind of small gentry status, they had fairly distinguished careers in the British Army. One of them in particular got to be a kind of a senior general. Forte was engineering. He played a role in containing the Boers during the Boer War at the end of the 19th century. So in terms of the family, he and Lena are the 2 that have a claim to fame and about whom you'll find material online. There are 5 girls. As far as I can make out, only one of them seems to have married. They would have been educated at home. The boys, of course, would have been sent off. The mother died the year after the Wimbledon, 1891, but she had been a long time a widow. Lena's father died in 1868. So an obvious question is, what were their roots in the area? What were their roots in New Win as a family? Well, they didn't have any. The 2 of them, Anne Gard and Lena's father, they married in May 1852. They married in Dublin. Each of them, through ancillary family members, did have some connections with the county. And Gard's father, for example, he was his middle name was Prendergast. He's buried in New Win, and in the 1880s he came to live there when she was a widow. When they married, the parents of Lena Rice, he was 25, she was 24. She's the one that had the money. Her father was a barrister, and they were looking around to set up his daughter. Through the Incumbent Estates Court, after the famine, lots of estates came on the market. Big estates, thousands of acres, small estates. The Marl Hill estate was, basically it's the townland of Marl Hill, so it's 6, 7, 9 acres. So it's quite a small estate, but with a nice house. The house is valued at that time, so you can get a sense of the house, it was about £20. Thomastown Castle is valued at 100. So nice, small country house with a reasonable amount of land, some of which they farmed themselves and the rest was let to tenants. And from that, obviously, they had not a huge income, but enough to keep them in the style to which they thought they should become accustomed. It was not Lena Rice's father who bought the estate. As I say, it was Anne Gard's father who had made his money in Dublin, and the amount paid for the estate was £3,000. And the estate was bought from the O'Mahers, who, as the name would suggest, had been there a long time and had roots. But of course, what happened then was, like a lot of these families, they drowned in debt. And there's one quote, Tady O'Maher was the chap who sold the estate. This is just a quotation which tells you everything you need to know about Tady. He was a thorough gentleman by principle and education, but he was too fond of racing, which eventually ruined him. So hence the estate had to be bought. And so you had this barrister chap in Dublin, Prendergast Gard, given that his daughter, Anne, had made an unsuitable match, and we'll see how unsuitable, she needed to be set up, so this estate was bought in Marl Hill. And that brings us to 1860. Some of the children, as I said, they had 8 children. Some of them were born in Marl Hill. Most of them were born in Marl Hill, including Lena. Their life would have proceeded as you'd expect. I mean, hunting, fishing and shooting, looking after tenants, assuming, and then farming your own, because he did farm over 100 acres of the land himself. And then something happened, which brings us to the start of this sequential story, which brings us from 1860 to his death in 1868. And there doesn't appear to be any memory of this in the area or in New Inn. Anyway, so to start our story, so to speak, on the night of Wednesday, the 21st of November, 1860, at around 11 o'clock, some 40 tons of hay and around 200 barrels of oats stacked in the haggard at Marl Hill went up in flames. Now, the fire was so dramatic that you could see the fire in Cashel. Farm workers subsequently described the flames were found issuing from different parts of the yard at the same time. An important clue, maybe, to what might have been happening. And in spite of help from New Inn and Cashel and even Care, the produce of his entire farm has been destroyed, with all the food that Mr. Rice had for 30 head of cattle and 8 or 9 horses. So obviously a disaster. And so he put in his claim for compensation, and his initial claim was for £450. Now, money values are always a bit distracting, because you say £450, it doesn't seem like very much. But translated, it's about €75,000. So, substantial amount of money. And that's the claim he put in. Now, to put in that claim and to have the money paid, he needed to make a case that there had been malicious damage. And his story was that he had evicted a tenant. And so this was payback for the eviction, in which case then he could get compensation from local taxation from the rates. Now, he got the compensation that he looked for, but there was no guarantee that he would. And of course, local taxpayers weren't going to be too happy to want to pay any compensation. So it's not as if money was going to be thrown at him. And a month later, there was a notice in the local press, and this is just a month later, that there'd be an important auction of cattle, horses, pigs, farming implements, and so on at Marl Hill. So this all looks pretty disastrous. He's going to have to sell off stuff because he doesn't have the money. And there's a delay in the compensation being paid. So he has his problems. Now, the question of he being paid the compensation, that, naturally enough, there was a delay before the local power brokers would meet in Cashel to discuss whether they would pay him this money. And at that stage, he had reduced his claim for compensation by £200, which is a huge amount, which might make one suspicious that he's trying it on a bit. But even that wasn't paid. They kicked it down and said, right, well, we'll have to wait until the grand jurors meet in Clonmel. And it was delayed, which can't have been helpful for him. Now, his claim all the time was that, as I say, he had evicted some tenant, and so this was payback. And that really would have been understood by everybody, particularly in Tipperary, because everybody knew that in the area we are, that William Rowe of Rockwell had been murdered a few years earlier. There was an element of discontent in the area, because a short time afterwards, somebody else who had come into the area in exactly the same circumstances as Rice was also killed, and that was Gustave Thibault, who was the initial person who came into Rockwell. Now, a slight detour. I keep referring to Lena Rice's father as our main character, but kind of a complication. His name is Spring Rice. And that's a complication because there is a Spring Rice family. They have an estate near Foynes. Spring Rice being a double-barreled name. There are two famous members of the family. So Cecil Spring Rice was the British ambassador in Washington during the First World War. And then the other, who be a cousin of his, was Mary Spring Rice, and opposite politics, was involved in gun running with the volunteers and all of that. So those are the two famous Spring Rices. Now the problem is that Lena Rice's father, his Christian name is Spring, not part of his surname. So there's something going on with his parents wanting to give the impression that he's a member of this quite distinguished family from Clare with their thousands and thousands of acres. But there were other claims made during the 1860s that in fact it was part of the game that he was playing, that he actually wasn't a member of that family, and that's kind of what was going on there, that he was Spring Rice because he was. So I don't know what the answer to it is, but it's all a little bit fishy. As you learn more about Mr. Rice, you'll see that it's kind of par for the course. So anyway, his crops are burned. Now that fire was the 21st of November, 1860. A month later, the PP in New Inn delivers a sermon. It's Sunday the 22nd of October, so it's just a month later. Now the PP at the time is John Ryan, Templemore native. He was ordained 1833. He was curate in Clarehan, Ula, Knockavella and Cashel before he settled up in New Inn, Knockgraffan. 1855 he came to New Inn, Knockgraffan, much the same time as the Rice family did. And he remained there until he died in 1891. So he was there a long time and was quite active politically. Now, the reason one knows about the stuff between 1860 and 68 when Rice died is there was a lot of litigation, which is always good from a historical point of view, not great otherwise. And so this is his account of the sermon that he gave that Sunday, and he's giving this information under oath. So given that he's a good Catholic parish priest and it's under oath, we'll take it that it is accurate. And it's quite extraordinary. Okay, I mentioned the name Mr. Spring Rice to my congregation, stating that he was the father of an illegitimate child, he being at the same time a married man. I also said that towards his wife, Mr. Rice acted anything but as a gentleman and made no effort to repair the injury, but instead of that left the unfortunate wretch, the mother of the child, to rot on a dunghill in Lough Kent. And this 13 or 14 days after the child was christened, and he had ample time to make restitution if he chose. Her mother, that's the child's grandmother, told me that this girl, the child's mother, was forced against her will in the dairy at Marl Hill, and I stated that publicly in the chapel. I also say I forbid any Catholic girl, as their parish priest, from taking service in Mr. Rice's household. But if they like, they could disobey me, and if Catholic girls were obliged by necessity or want of employment to take outdoor work with him, as the law of the land forbade them for self-protection to carry arms, they ought to carry with them strong, sharp knives, and if Mr. Rice laid hands upon them improperly, to use them in self-defense. As Mr. Rice did not conduct himself as a gentleman, I forbade my people, who were remarkable for their respect to the neighbouring gentlemen, from putting their hands to their hats as he passed. I never asked my people if they were aware of who Mr. Spring Rice was, that he was a scamp and outcast of society, before he met with the present Mrs. Rice, who took compassion on him and prevented him from emigrating to a foreign country. But I said that I was informed that he was going to Sydney to seek his fortune, but he had the good luck in meeting with his present wife, who put him in a respectable position. I never, weasel words here from the parish priest, I never denounced Mr. Rice from the altar. What else had he been doing? But mentioned his name. I did so for the protection of my flock. The child which he had, and whose paternity he must admit, was christened on the 8th of October, and nothing was done until the Sunday week following, during which time he had ample opportunity of making reparation. And if you look on the baptism register of New Inn, Knockgraffan, for the 8th of October, 1860, Mary Rice was baptized, the mother being Catherine Ryan. And the important point is, Father Ryan made sure that Spring Rice was listed as the father. The fact that you had the local landlord and one of the domestics becoming pregnant and having a baby wasn't that remarkable. There has to be something else going on, because this is a vendetta between the parish priest and the landlord between Ryan and Rice that's pursued to the point where it's over because Rice is dead, and he's dead by his early 40s. Just as Ryan is hostile to Rice, he's very sympathetic to Anne Rice, Rice's wife. Okay, so what happens next? He delivers his sermon, and so there has to be some blowback. And of course there is, but it's not what you might expect. This talk basically is centered on a sequence of 9 letters. And so this is the first, they're short. So this is the first of the letters. Okay, after the sermon, clearly it's all anybody in the area was talking about. And so this is the letter from Anne Rice to Father Ryan. Sir, it has occurred to me to ask you a question, in confidence, relative to a subject which has within the last few days caused me much uneasiness. The substance is this. A letter came for me a few mornings ago, which on Mr. Rice opening it, he found it to be anonymous. He requested to read it first, saying he would afterwards give it to me. He would not then do so, notwithstanding all my entreaties and promises that I would treat it as I have before treated such letters with contempt. So, not the first anonymous letter. Judging from his agitated manner, I cannot divest myself of the idea that some guilty acts of which he could not clear himself must have been stated in the letter. You who know and make it your business conscientiously to know the will of those under you will not, I trust, object to telling me all. So you see how bizarre all this is? The wife of the local landlord, Protestant, pillar of the establishment, writing to the local parish priest, looking for information about her errant husband. So, am I right in mixing up the name of a person named Catherine Ryan, so she has the gist of it, as a guilty party? I shall take it as the greatest act of kindness to inform me in every way. And if I have mentioned the right person, where she and hers are, and all about her. So I want further information, or I want confirmation. Hoping you will excuse this trouble, believe me, yours truly, A. Rice, Anne Rice. And then there's a P.S. A messenger will call for an answer on Monday morning at 7 o'clock. So pretty startling letter. So letter number 2 then is Ryan's response. New Inn, 13th of January, 1861. Madam, I could not think of writing out all the disgusting details of the matter referred to in your note of this day. If you could find time to call on me, I would then most reluctantly give you all the particulars you require. If you are to call on me, a line will be necessary saying at what time, as I am generally not at home till late in the day. Your obedient servant, John Ryan. P.S. Enclosed copy of stamped extracts from the parish register, showing Mary, illegitimate daughter of Spring Rice, Marl Hill, and Catherine Ryan. The sponsor is Judith Burke. PPS. Spring Rice is said to have given those people a large sum of money to get them to quit the country. They are supposed to be now living in Liverpool. Okay. Letter number 3 is Anne Rice to Father Ryan. And in that, she refers to some of her domestic servants, people called the Murphys. It's not clear what she's getting at, but in the division between herself and her husband and the kind of war that was being waged, the Murphys she thought were on her side, but it turns out that they weren't. Because they're all Catholics, of course, all the domestics were Catholics. She expected the parish priest to be able to do something about it. So this is letter number 3. Dear Sir, I feel much obliged for the disclosures which it was your painful duty to communicate to me this morning. I feel bowed down with sorrow, but a blessing may come from it all to those who are the innocent sufferers. Many thanks for your kindly offering to communicate with me in person. Would you have any objection to coming here at 3 o'clock? I should call on you myself, but an investigation into the whole matter may be more fully carried out by your coming here and calling on many witnesses in the house, inside and outside, to prove distinctly to Mr. Rice his awful guilt, which he still persists in denying. I have ordered the Murphys to be present at this investigation, but from what I could hear from Pat Murphy, they object to coming. Of course, if you order them, they will obey. I would be very much obliged if you compelled them to come. Ellie Murphy, who I may say I always looked on in the light of mother, I leave it to yourself to say what do they deserve. She, who I opened the secrets of my heart to have seen me and my children wronged and brought to misery, the consequence of villainy. Mr. Rice is greatly exasperated. I bet he is. But you will not mind him. Truth will always stand. Don't spare him if you meet him here today. Thanking you for your kindness, and believe me, yours very truly, A. Rice. And then there's another P.S. Will you tell Pat any arrangements you will kindly make about coming? So she's asking the parish priest to actually come to Marl Hill and kind of do a Father Brown, kind of the investigating priest, if you know the TV series. I mean, it's very bizarre. Needless to say, he doesn't go to the house. So this is number 4. And it's the letter from Father Ryan to Anne Rice. New Inn, the 14th of January 1861. Dear Madam, I would readily accede to the request in your note of this day, but there are certain circumstances in existence that render a visit from me to Marl Hill House at present an impossibility. You may rest assured that it was not because I wished to inflict any unnecessary pain, simply because a gentlewoman, the honour of whose house was compromised, urged me to do so, that I assented to give you all the particulars of this detestable occurrence. Now, however, that you have all substantial information, I would prefer having nothing more to say about it. If it be any consolation to you in your affliction, I assure you that I and my people deeply sympathize with you and your innocent children, for we have a sincere respect for you. There's another matter which I would wish to say a word or two to you upon, and for this purpose I am content to meet you at the door of the church, or courthouse, or post office, or police barracks, or the high road. Very odd. Anyway, yours sincerely, John Ryan. So this is backwards and forwards for these few days between the parish priest and the lady of the manor, so to speak. So where is the lord of the manor in all of this? Now, this is the first communication we have from Spring Rice. It's written in an absolute fury. The syntax is all over the place, and it doesn't come across that he has a huge amount of education, which he may not have had, I don't know. There's no salutation in it. There's a date, 15th of January 1861. So this is to the parish priest, Father Ryan. I have just seen a letter signed John Ryan, which I presume is yours. You refused to come down here to investigate and explain your conduct of Mrs. Rice, which I must say is most disgraceful, and everything but what a man, no matter how illiterate he may be, should do wearing the robes of a clergyman. You have also prevented my giving you my mind, which perhaps was as well for you to avoid. However, you shall have a portion of my mind and ideas. You've been speaking in the most disgraceful language to yourself and to your flock, who are disgusted with you for the past 3 months, as also on a former occasion, a few years since, about me, all of which I have looked over and intend to have done. But now, up to this date, my solicitor shall deal with you. Now I have only to add for the future, if you make use of my name, pro or con, or that you have or hold any private intercourse or any more correspondence with Mrs. Rice, I shall take the first opportunity of gratifying that desire which I should have realized the first time you had the impertinence of mentioning my name, Spring Rice. And then there's a P.S. I beg to remark, should you feel inclined to answer this, I shall not receive it by letter. So no surprise in that. Arising from that, there are 2 court cases. Okay, so that letter that I've just read, which is a bit far-fetched, Father Ryan claimed was a threatening letter, which I can't read it as such. It's very impolite and rude and all the rest of it, but it's not threatening. So Father Ryan sued Spring Rice. It would appear that Ryan's agenda is to keep the pot boiling with regard to Spring Rice. And there is, of course, a whole pattern and tradition of threatening letters, which the police, did take very seriously, having to do with disputes over lands and rents and so on. So the problem about bringing a thing to court is you've no control over what questions are going to be asked. And so once this thing went into court, the issue of all the crops being burnt, remember that, the point at which we started, where all the crops were burnt, that was going to come up again as to what was going on there. There were 3 possible explanations as to what was happening there. That it was an agrarian crime, and that it was payback for Rice having evicted a tenant, which is what he claimed. That's one possibility. The other was, of course, because it came a month after the famous sermon, that it was the response of some locals being stirred up because of the sermon. And then the third is that Rice himself was responsible, looking for the compensation money. So that's the third possibility. And of course, Father Ryan himself floated that idea, and again, they're weasel words. I never gave it to understand that Mr. Rice was instrumental in burning his own haggard, but I said there were rumours flying that such was the case. And at this stage, Ryan insisted that this letter is threatening and that he feels fearful. I mean, he was asked the question in the barracks, do you fear bodily injury? And to which he gave the straightforward reply, yes, I do, which means that the police had to pursue it. So Spring Rice was bound over to keep the peace, which he can't have been happy about, and he had to pay sureties. He was given bail, £20, 2 sureties, £10 each. We're now to January 1861, and there's that whole issue of the crops and who was responsible. So that's another issue that Spring Rice had thought was dealt with. Some of the ratepayers now say, we want our money back. The compensation money should not have been paid. And so a case is heard with the grand jury with regard to that. Spring Rice has to give evidence about the fire and the whole circumstances. And that date of that fire is the 21st November 1860. And this is his version of the evening of the fire. He was home from around 4 in the afternoon. He went to bed at around 9:30. At an unspecified time, his wife came to him, asked if he smelled smoke. He did, and then what happens next is a bit odd, assumed it was a problem with the chimney. He did not get up and investigate, but told Mrs. Rice to send one of the domestics through the house to ascertain if it was all right. Anyway, she returned and said she could discover nothing wrong. Rice was about to retire again when there was a knocking at the front door that raised the alarm. And Rice ordered another one of the servants to go and call the people on the road, as there was a fire outside, and raise the alarm at that stage. And then when it came to asking Rice questions, he was asked about his reluctance to get up. And this is his response. I said, what was the use of my getting up? That the domestic was in the next room and she could look through the house as easily as I could. He then gave his version of the initial alarm and the names of the men on hand to try and deal with the fire. One of the village policemen told the court, I saw Mr. Rice doing nothing. I saw the neighbours and the people exerting themselves, but not him. But then one of the domestics in the house confirmed that Mr. Rice hadn't left the house until the fire was confirmed. So that would seem to be in his favour. So in order to reverse the compensation judgment, of course, there was the question of the motivation for the fire. Was it an agrarian crime thing? And Rice, of course, was able to give his costings that he had lost 12.5 acres of hay at £9 an acre and so on. Anyway, the best case against the compensation being paid was from one of the local men who arrived on the scene during the fire. And his evidence was that he didn't see Mr. Rice helping to put out the fire, but he also heard him say that the fire had such a hold that nothing could be done and that people shouldn't risk injury and just let it burn out. However, another witness was of the opinion that more of the crops could have been saved. So the people who have to make this judgment, I'm not sure on what basis they could make it because the evidence is so contradictory. But clearly the judge in this hearing was fed up. He just said the compensation order has to stand. So that seems to be good news for Rice. One of the claims that Rice was making here, of course, which might have had some justification, was that apart from the argy-bargy with Ryan and the stuff of the illegitimate child and so on, but that everything Ryan was doing was actually putting his life genuinely in danger. Because what I said, in April 1862, this guy who'd come from France, Gustave Thibault, who'd come in under the same circumstances, bought land through the Incumbent Estates Court, was murdered because of a dispute with tenants. You know, the risk to life was, in that sense, was very real. And very much brought home to Rice, because when Thibault was murdered, Rice actually served on the coroner's jury, so he would have viewed the body. So there was a certain amount of legitimacy to his being fearful. Now, you might think, okay, there's been this court case, Rice has been held over, Ryan might be satisfied, the compensation claim was to be paid, and you think, okay, Rice will be satisfied. But no, Ryan is determined to keep the pot stirred. And what he does next is, I mean, if you think to now has been odd, it's very bizarre. There's a newspaper published in Nina, Tipperary Vindicator, and that's significant. I mean, there are plenty of South Tipperary newspapers. At the time, the obvious one in Clonmel would be the Tipperary Free Press. But this anonymous letter appears in the Vindicator, presumably because the other newspaper editors wouldn't print it. But Maurice Lenihan, the guy who ran the Vindicator, was of a different mind, and so he published it. And it was anonymous. It was from, quote unquote, one of the people. Now, the author of this letter is Father Ryan. And the stuff he states in this is even more weird than the stuff we've already been through. This is 1862, so we've just moved on a bit. This is what he's saying in this letter. He's telling a story about what's going on in New Inn. The two local JPs, Justices of the Peace, held an investigation this week into the sending of a threatening letter to Spring Rice. The following astounding particulars have come out under oath once the police got involved and investigated the threatening letter. And the main person at the centre of this story is, again, one of the domestics in the house, a girl called Bridget Dunn. And this is her story. Now, she, of course, would have told everything to the priest, who was, her parish priest, and he then writes this letter anonymously to the local press. On last Wednesday week, Mr. Rice dined alone, and she was attending him. Okay, she's a maid in the house. After dinner, he told her he was thinking of going to Australia, but that he couldn't get Mrs. Rice to go with him. He then asked her, Bridget, if she would go with him, and she moved to the door to leave the parlour, getting a bit nervous. He then said it would be a good plan to frighten Mrs. Rice, to make her want to leave the area, if Bridget wrote a threatening letter to Mr. Rice. You see what he's thinking? If this letter comes, Mrs. Rice might take fright and be glad to get out of the area. He then asked Bridget to write such a letter and promised that if she did, he would take her with him to Australia. She felt insulted at the proposal and left the parlour. He cried out after her that he wasn't joking, but quite in earnest. After a little time, he rang the parlour bell. She answered it. He then asked her to write a threatening letter to himself and that he would give her £10 and take her to Australia. After repeatedly urging his request, or rather an order between master and servant, again, the dynamic that's going on here, she has to hold on to her job. He told her it was only to carry out a bit of a frolic, so it's all a joke, and he wants her to play a part. Believing this, she, Bridget, consented to write, and as she was required, so she said, right, I'll write the letter. It's a big joke on Mrs. Rice. He then mixed punch for her, which she refused, and he started from the sofa and tried to force the glass into her hands. She succeeded in not taking it. On the following Friday evening, she wrote the threatening letter, referring in it, as she was ordered by Mr. Rice, to Mr. Rice having evicted. So there had to be a reason for the threat, and so that he had evicted a tenant. Same story as before. And not just evicted a tenant, but John Downey of Marl Hill and his sickly poor family. So how's the letter going to be delivered? So Bridget then hung the letter by a nail on the door of the privy, which would have been outside, of course. At 1 o'clock next day, it was found by Miss Tiny Rice. Tiny, obviously, it's the baby of the family. It's, I think, Agnes, who would be then about 2. So Mr. Rice himself then got it, pretended to be greatly alarmed, and sent a new in for the police. And he applied to the police then for protection and got it, because as I said, the police would have taken it very, very seriously. Then at this stage, poor Bridget is in a bit of a conundrum because there's all this commotion, police and so on, and she's in the middle of it. And she realizes it's not really any more a joke, and that it was being worked up by her designing master into a frightfully serious matter. And of course, she goes and talks to her parish priest. And so he sees how he can use this. So Mr. Rice, who up to this point succeeded even beyond his calculations in alarming the police and the magistrates, saw that his game, whatever it was up if the honest servant, yes, of course, if Bridget spilled the beans and was believed, well, then obviously he was going to be in trouble. And so he had to cover for that and come up with a plausible story and blame Bridget that it wasn't at all his doing. And then there's the issue. It turns out that the envelope that was used to deliver the letter was clearly an envelope that had originated within the household. This was supposed to be a letter that comes from somebody unknown outside. So it's not terribly carefully thought through. This is so explosive that, of course, Rice can't let it pass. So obviously he has to take action. He takes action for libel against Ryan. Previous case had been Ryan against Rice. But there's a year's delay before it's actually heard. The case isn't heard locally. They move it to North Tipperary, where there'd be less local pressure. The issues with regard to the letter are, because it's anonymous, remember, did Ryan write it? And that's very easily cleared up because Ryan at this stage isn't denying it. And in any case, the QC acting for Rice talked to the editor of the newspaper, and he was not in the business of protecting his sources and actually showed the original of the letter. So that issue was cleared. It was Father Ryan. But then the second issue, of course, was who was the instigator here? Who was actually manipulating whom? Was it Rice manipulating the maid and terrifying her into doing this weird stuff? Or was it the maid who was in some way this manipulative hussy? At the end, you kind of take your choice. The case for Rice was opened by his QC. And of course, he begins by emphasizing that Rice is this pillar of the community and that he's being got at by this dreadful domestic, this viper that they brought into the house. And that given the local atmosphere about threats and so on, that his life is really at risk. And that given that it was the parish priest had written this, that it was, apart from anything else, it was a very unchristian thing to be doing, not the behavior you'd expect from a parish priest. Rice's story, he then had to explain the events of the day, which I already mentioned, who said what to whom in terms of that day when he was communicating with the maid. Well, his version of events was that he'd gone into Cashel, and while waiting for his wife, who had some calls to make, he went into a local hotel, Corcoran's Hotel. He played pool in the billiard room. None of that's important. The important point is that when he was leaving, there was some little twittering in the hotel with reference to his wife having come for him, and some jokes were made not quite satisfactory to Mr. Rice. So obviously there was a lot of talk about him. On the way home, there was a row between himself and his wife. And that has to explain then, because when he's dining, he's not with his wife, because the interaction between himself and Bridget is just the two of them. So the question, if you ask the question, well, where was his wife? Well, she was dining separately because they'd had this row coming back from Cashel. Bridget Dunn, there are various references here. They say she's about 20. Apparently, she had given satisfaction to Mrs. Rice, who had in fact increased her wages. In court, of course, the threatening letter was read out, bearing in mind that this isn't a genuine threatening letter concocted by Spring Rice, but written by Bridget at his behest and put in the privy to be found. It's actually not a bad construct because it's semi-literate, which is usually what these letters were. Again, there's no opening. It just says, wipe your nose with this when you read it. Threatening for the cause of starvation which you caused and have caused. Spring Rice, as sure as your name is Spring, you will get it if you don't be more careful of yourself. For there are some people on you now. I that wrote this is one of the party, and when we see you in care on Thursday evening, and we were watching you. But you did not come home that night, and if you did, you would get it as well as Thibault got it. And it is not gone from you, so be watchful of yourself, and wherever you go, have a protector with you. And warn the police to be on hand night and day, for all the guns and pistols in New Inn won't save you. If they, the police, were not so constant about your place, long ago you'd have got it. But see how there will be some opportunity got of them. See how we post here tonight. This is a warning to you, for we don't wish to take you short. We wish to give you some time to make your soul. For you, bloody rogue, you thought it no sin or scruple to turn out a helpless young family on the side of the road. By all the devils in hell, there is 4 as good boys as there is men in Tipperary on your back. So the Lord have mercy on you. We don't want to lose a penny by you to post this, and so we got him to leave it here in the privy. So get the gist of it. Now, Rice's argument, of course, that this is a genuine threatening letter, and that in the circumstances that Rice has reason to be fearful. At this stage, poor Bridget is, of course, terrified to be locked into the middle of this. So she confesses and says, to justify Rice's case, that it was entirely her doing and that she was, in fact, this manipulative hussy. She then has to come up with a reason why she wrote a threatening letter. Okay, so her reason why she wrote the threatening letter was, again, it's a bit bizarre, but everything in this is bizarre. She had a boyfriend in Kilkee. If she could get the Rice family out of New Inn, she was hoping that they would take themselves off to Kilkee. Maybe they were in the tradition of going to be somewhere, but he was in Kilkee. And so to justify this whole palaver about the boyfriend, who was Michael Riley, she then has to concoct another letter. And this is one that she concocts herself. This is number 8. This is purports to be a love letter from Michael Riley, who's in Kilkee, to Bridget Dunn, who's in New Inn. Kilkee, July 3rd, 1862. My dear Bridget, I take my pen in hand, my dearest dear, to write these few lines, hoping to find you in good health, as this leaves me at present. Thanks be to God. My dear Bridget, I feel very lonesome when I received your last letter, when you told me you were not to come here this season. I think you could come if you liked, but I suppose you don't care, as you've come someone else in your own county, which leaves me here broken-hearted. If you would only come, I would send you money, or I should feel so happy when I would get the word that you would come. I hope you'll excuse this paltry writing. I hope you will answer this soon as you get it. I am, my dear Bridget, your true lover, Michael Riley. Now, it turns out apparently that there is an actual Michael Riley with whom she did have some relationship, and he was in Kilkee, but he didn't write this letter. So all of this is Rice's case. Is the court going to buy this? Is the jury going to buy this? That this domestic is manipulating everybody and is coming up with these fantastical schemes? And then Bridget, because she's so terrified, understandably, to be mixed in all of this, she's persuaded to write a confession about her role. Now, this suits Rice because it kind of lets him off the hook. July 16th, 1862. Mr. Rice, I write to you these few lines to implore of you to forgive me for what I've done. And I'm sorry to the heart for it is, so I beg you to take compassion on me, to save me from all danger. There never was anyone living who implicated that letter but myself. And I did it out of a frolicsome trick to get you to go to Kilkee for some time. So I beg you, I implore forgiveness from you and for all that have gone to such trouble by my foolishness to have caused such trouble. I implore of you, Mr. Rice, to save me. I am the guilty person. can imagine the pressure that would have been put on her to write that. So that's the case for Spring Rice, and that seems to kind of let him off the hook. If you believe that everybody's been manipulated by this domestic servant who can write different kinds of letters to suit different kinds of occasions. I mean, she's amazingly skillful. So then it finishes with the case for Ryan and his QC. First of all, he begins by admitting, yes, the letter was written by Ryan. That's not in dispute. And regarding Bridget Dunn, the lawyer promised to present her, of course, in a very different light, that she was an innocent put upon by Spring Rice. Of course, there was a reference to a lot of the murky stuff that was associated with Spring Rice, the illegitimate child, the compensation claim for all that stuff was referenced. We got some background with regard to Bridget. When she was hired as a maid by Mrs. Rice, she was so pleased with her that she increased her wages. She was getting £5 a year, and that was increased to £6. So everything seemed to be okay there. The story about Rice in Cashel, we got his version to explain why the family weren't dining together. There was this row. But an alternative version of that is that, yes, he was in Cashel, yes, he played billiards or whatever, but that he really was being at the target of pointed jokes, and that everybody was really kind of laughing at him. And that he was so disgruntled by all of this that he genuinely did want to leave the area. And it was genuinely the case that his wife wouldn't go with him, or would be glad maybe to be away from him. So this seemed to be evidence for what was happening. On the Wednesday, Bridget was asked if she'd written the letter. Again, that was admitted that she had written the letter. The issue was, under whose instruction? Did she make up the letter herself, or was it Spring Rice? And at that stage, of course, the authorities were called. It was admitted that the key thing was kind of genuine insofar as there was a Michael Riley. Everybody was looking forward to Bridget Dunn herself giving evidence. Obviously, Ryan's QC was going to treat her gently, whereas Rice's QC was going to tear her apart. She explained that her father was a carpenter from near Clonolty. She began in service in April '61, so she hadn't been working there very long as a housemaid. I mentioned about the wages being increased. She did say that Mr. and Mrs. Rice lived on bad terms, which is not a surprise. He was in the habit of drinking. Remember, we saw before about the punch and so on. And then there was this odd story. On the day after the whole business, Rice had wanted to go into care. He wanted to take the jaunting car. But, quote, my mistress wouldn't allow it. She and her family and all the children, however many were there then, went to the coach house and sat on the car. She was crying and said that the horse and car were hers and he couldn't have them. And so Mr. Rice then gave up and walked to care and stayed out that night and come back on the following day. So obviously a lot of stuff going on. When Spring Rice himself appeared on the stand, he was obviously well coached, and he stuck absolutely to what the line that had been put out, that it was entirely down to Bridget, and that because she wanted to go to Kilkee, and that he wasn't a drinker. What he said was he always had 2 tumblers of punch after dinner, but he was perfectly sober. And then, of course, an absolute ordeal, poor Mrs. Rice had to take the stand. Nobody was really going to attack her because she was really seen by everybody to be the victim in this. And in any case, she hadn't been in the room when the stuff was going on with Bridget. So she really didn't have anything to add or take from it. The judge then kind of summed up. It was quite clear, bearing in mind that here you have a landed gentleman, pillar of the community, leaving aside all the personal stuff, but who and what he is, thinking of his position, on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have a female domestic. So it's a very unequal contest. The judge, and it's an all-male jury, of course, too, the judge is quite explicit about, and he says one thing is, apart from passing kind of derogatory remarks about Bridget's appearance, that they weren't even sure what age she was, that she was so kind of woebegone looking, he wasn't too thrilled, the judge, this is, about the parish priest having much status. And he has one lovely line, talking about whatever damages the jury might come up with, well, to remember that the defendant was only a parish priest and that the incomes of parish priests were usually small. So in case they thought of, coming up with a lot. Anyway, the jury took 2 hours to make up their minds, which is a surprise. Their decision was inevitable. Obviously, Rice won. Well, kind of. He was awarded £20, which would be around €4,000. But the costs that he would have had to pay, that wasn't going to compensate him. But maybe he felt he had a kind of a moral victory, I don't know. That's not the end of it, because basically from then to when he dies in '68, and he dies in his early 40s, it's one thing after another. And clearly, nobody wants to have much to do with him anymore. Kind of a bad smell about him. So he feels that he has to leave the area. Short time afterwards, the local press has advertising the fact that the house is up for rent. Everything in the house is being sold, including the mattresses. I mean, literally everything. And the emphasis in the advertising is that this is such a kind of a rush sale that there are no reserve prices. So clearly, you'll have bargains for all. And the sale was on the instruction from Spring Rice, quote, who has decided on going to reside on the continent. So he's clearing out, not to Australia, but on the continent. So he does clear out for a time. I don't think he goes to the continent. I think he goes elsewhere in Ireland, and the house is let temporarily, which isn't that unusual. I mean, people sometimes did that if they needed to cut back on expenses. You just simply kind of downsized and you let the property. They are back when, 21st of June 1866, their daughter Helena is born. She is born in New Inn in the house. Then in 1868, so they're back about 2 years, dies in 68, and he's 41. It's interesting that his death is entirely ignored by the local press. Normally you'd expect there'd be some coverage, but there isn't any. But, interesting piece of evidence, given all that had happened, you would expect that Mr. and Mrs. Rice wouldn't be sleeping together anymore, but they are, because 3 years afterwards, after he dies, their 3-year-old son unfortunately dies. They have 3 sons. 2 of them, as I said, had military careers and were successful, but this chap, Samuel Pollock Rice, he dies in May 1871 at 3. Again, if you look at the graves in New Inn, you'll see his name on one of the stones. He's buried with his father, who had died 3 years earlier. And it's interesting, but not surprising, I suppose, that when Anne Rice comes to die, which is years and years later, she's not buried with her husband. All in the one area, of course, but she's not with her husband. The family remain in Marl Hill. After the mother is running the place with the help of a land agent who is in care, who looks after big estates. But the day-to-day management of the tenants and their own farm has to be done by themselves. And it's very much a household of women. As I said, Helena, after the mother dies, has her role, because there's letters here, in fact, in some of the files upstairs, where she's communicating with local solicitors about farm business. Another one of her sisters dies in 86. Her mother's father had come to live with them, the guy who had the money. He dies in 88. And then Lena dies of TB, which, as you know, was the kind of the scourge of the period. There isn't any kind of big final leaving of the family. It's kind of by drips. Some of the girls, they're over in England with their 2 soldier brothers, one of whom is married, the other isn't. And they're over and back. They're here for some of the time. The rest of the time, the house is let. And certainly by the War of Independence time, the house seems to be in the hands of somebody called W.P. Ryan, who was a stud farm there, horses and all that. So as I said, there's no one dramatic moment when they leave. So they were here for those 2 generations. Remembered now largely because of that article in 1988. Lena Rice had been kind of forgotten before that article. But nobody knew anything about that first generation. For good reason. I mean, it is such an odd. But if you're in New Inn, attention has lately been paid to the grave, and it's in a little cutaway place. It's interesting to see it, and the other members of the family. It's kind of a little place to itself in the middle of the village. It's quite odd. But I think you will agree with me, it is a very odd story. With regard to the parish priest, there are diocesan sources that one would have looked at and would have expected this carry on with Rice to have surfaced, but it doesn't. I could find no reference. So it's not a surprise that as a story that it was totally forgotten. Next time Wimbledon comes round, you'll never be able to think of Lena Rice in quite the same way again. Thank you very much.